So tonight, we're diving into a regime that's projecting this image of unshakable power while its own people are rising up. But what really happens when a government just shuts down the internet to hide its response? We're going to peel back the layers of propaganda and violence to get to the bottom of what's really happening inside Iran.
Wow. Okay, it doesn't get much more direct than that, does it? This wasn't some quiet diplomatic cable. This was a public threat from Iran's supreme leader, Khamenei, aimed right at the President of the United States. But a statement that bold, it really makes you wonder, is this a sign of strength, or is it a sign of a regime that feels its power slipping away?
And this slide, it just captures the core conflict perfectly. On one side, you've got these defiant public declarations for the whole world to hear. But on the other, there's a terrifying reality for Iranian citizens, completely hidden by an internet shutdown. So the regime is busy crafting one message for the international community while waging a hidden war on its own people.
All right, so let's start by breaking down this public performance. The regime's message to the world is this really carefully constructed facade, and it's built on a mix of historical threats and just some stunning hypocrisy.
So in his first big speech on the protests, Khamenei offered zero concessions. Instead, he starts drawing these parallels to ancient history, framing his enemies as tyrants. You see, his entire worldview is shaped by the 1979 revolution. He believes the Shah was overthrown because he showed weakness and gave in to demands. For Khamenei, history is not going to repeat itself. Any concession in his mind is just a step towards collapse.
And this is where the hypocrisy just gets stunning. As Khamenei was giving this speech, his official Twitter account was live tweeting it. The bitter irony here is that this was all happening during a nationwide internet lockdown that silenced millions of his own citizens. The message was never, ever for them. It was pure propaganda for the outside world.
So all this public posturing is hiding a much, much darker reality. With the internet shut down, what was the regime so desperate to conceal? Well, now we turn to the atrocities that took place in that digital darkness.
But here's the thing. A total blackout is nearly impossible in our modern age. Information finds a way to leak out, and eyewitnesses with access to satellite internet are starting to paint a horrifying picture of the violence on the ground. Now, to really understand the scale of what was happening, let's look at a recent conflict for comparison. During that 12-day war between Israel and Hamas-led militants just last year, the total number of civilian casualties was staggering. Okay, just hold that thought.
This is a direct quote from a surgeon in Tehran. And get this, he wasn't talking about the whole country, just what he was witnessing in his own city. He estimated that the number of protesters killed surpassed the civilian death toll of that entire war. I mean, that is a staggering claim that just brings the human cost into brutally sharp focus.
Yeah, make no mistake, this was not riot control, not even close. In cities like Farist, eyewitnesses reported security forces mounting military-grade heavy machine guns on the back of trucks and firing directly into crowds of protesters. This is basically an act of war against unarmed civilians. And the crackdown didn't stop on the streets. Oh no, the regime actually weaponized the healthcare system itself. Doctors received direct orders: do not treat injured protesters. Instead, you report them immediately to security forces. And they even began targeting doctors who are known to have helped protesters in past uprisings, turning healers into informants.
But here's the twist. For all its brutality, the crackdown might not be working. Leaked information from inside the regime reveals that officials are panicking. Behind closed doors, they're calling the movement an avalanche they can't contain. And that suggests the regime's grip is far more fragile than its public face lets on.
So this combination of extreme violence and internal panic has not gone unnoticed by the rest of the world. And that brings us to the international response, starting with some very direct warnings coming from Washington.
In a direct response to the regime's aggression, then-President Trump issued a really clear public warning. He basically said the U.S. was watching, and if the crackdown continued, there would be severe consequences. It was a direct counter-threat, force against force.
At the same time, though, a very different call came from Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah. His wasn't a threat, but a plea. He called on the international community for support and action, framing this as a desperate fight for freedom that required outside help to succeed.
So you've got these two opposing calls, one for threats, one for direct support, and they perfectly frame the central problem facing the international community. What is the right response? This brings us to the huge challenge known as the intervention dilemma.
As calls for help get louder and the atrocities mount, the pressure to do something becomes immense. But as with any internal conflict, the question of foreign intervention is incredibly complex and it's just fraught with unintended consequences.
So let's just walk through the primary dangers here. First, intervention is unpredictable. A foreign strike could accidentally harm the very protesters it's meant to help. Second, there's the risk of rapid escalation. A so-called limited action could spiral into a much wider regional conflict. And finally, there's the rally around the flag effect. A foreign attack could actually unite Iranians against a common enemy, ironically strengthening the very regime they're fighting.
But you gotta understand, the regime's strategy isn't just about blunt force. They also use this sophisticated tactic called tactical restraint. By allowing some protests to happen, they create a narrative that separates legitimate demonstrators from saboteurs. The goal is to divide the opposition and keep that large, undecided middle of society on the sidelines, preventing the movement from ever reaching a critical mass.
And so we're left on a knife's edge. You've got a desperate regime using brutal tactics against a protest movement that just refuses to die. You've got an international community threatening to intervene, even though that intervention could backfire spectacularly. All of which leads to the ultimate unanswered question: what is the breaking point for the Islamic Republic?
Something big is happening in Iran right now, and it's not just another protest on the streets. Our source for this explainer suggests that the very lifeblood of the Iranian economy, its energy sector, has now joined the fight, and it could be triggering a catastrophic chain reaction for the regime. Now, you might hear that and think it's a chant from a street protest, but it's not. According to our source, that's the sound coming from inside the control rooms of Iran's most vital energy facilities. The workers themselves have allegedly turned on the government. And that really brings us to the core question we're digging into today. We're going to explore the cascading consequences of this rebellion, from crippling the entire economy to shaking the very foundations of the regime itself. So here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the initial spark in the machine, follow the nationwide chain reaction it sets off, and see how that cracks the regime's international alliances. Then we'll look at how it starves the Revolutionary Guard, how the regime starts to come undone from the inside, and finally, we'll see how all this echoes the revolution of 1979. Okay, so while protests have reportedly spread across more than 100 cities, our source claims the whole game changed when a critical new front opened up: the energy sector. This is the moment the workers themselves became the protest. The source points to strikes at these three major nerve centers. We're talking about workers allegedly walking out of control rooms, bringing production to a dead stop in facilities that are the absolute backbone of Iran's economy. And just to give you an idea of the scale we're talking about here, take the South Pars facility. Our source claims it is single-handedly responsible for a whopping 70% of Iran's total gas production. So when it stops, the entire country feels it, and they feel it almost immediately. But look, this isn't just about a gas shortage, not even close. You see, the source points to this really critical technical dependency, a sort of hidden vulnerability that turns a strike at one facility into a full-blown national crisis. Okay, now what's so fascinating about this slide is the technical detail. For Iran's oil wells to actually work, they need natural gas from places like South Pars to be pumped back into them, just to keep the pressure up. So it's simple. No gas means no pressure, and no pressure means no oil. The workers who walked out knew this. A gas strike is an oil strike. And the fallout from that is just immense. The source alleges widespread power and internet blackouts, key industries like steel and cement grinding to a halt, and maybe most critically, a breakdown in the regime's own communication systems. You've got local security forces who can't even get orders from their command center. And right in the middle of all this chaos, our source points to an alleged speech from President Meshkin. Reportedly, he said this from a nice, warm room while citizens were literally freezing. And as you can imagine, words like these just poured gasoline on the fire of public anger. So this internal implosion is now sending massive shockwaves outward. It's directly threatening Iran's most powerful allies and its entire look east foreign policy, its big strategic pivot towards powers like China and Russia. And as you can see here, the problem for Beijing and Moscow is severe, but it hits them in different ways. For China, it's an energy nightmare. Their supply of cheap oil is threatened, and a massive $400 billion investment is suddenly at risk. For Russia, it means a key route for busting sanctions could collapse, and they could lose a major strategic ally. Just to put China's reliance into perspective for a second, our source states that over 90% of Iran's crude oil exports are headed for one place, China, sold at a huge discount. So this workers' strike is a direct threat to a critical economic lifeline for Chinese industry. But these strikes aren't just causing problems abroad. They're hitting the regime right where it hurts. According to the source, they're striking at the financial heart of its most powerful enforcers, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC. Yeah, so the source basically frames the IRGC not just as a military unit, but as this massive holding company. It argues that to really understand what's going on, you have to stop thinking of Iran's economy as a state economy and start seeing it as a corporate entity, with the IRGC as its CEO. And this chart really paints a picture of that control. It visualizes the claim that front companies tied to the Revolutionary Guard control something like 60% of Iran's key economic sectors: oil, gas, petrochemicals, you name it. The country's energy infrastructure is basically their personal cash cow. So here's the crucial point. When a worker turns a valve, they aren't just making a political statement. They are literally turning off the cash spigot that pays the salaries of the very soldiers meant to suppress them. In fact, the source claims there are already reports of salary delays for lower-ranking officers. This financial strangulation is now causing this massive domino effect. According to the source, it's not just crumbling Iran's strategy across the region, but its internal security is starting to fall apart as well. Our source uses a really powerful metaphor here. The ATM card has been pulled. For years, Iran's oil revenues funded its whole network of regional proxies, groups like Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. Well, without oil money, there are no dollars for missiles, no dollars for ammunition, no salaries for that entire network. And the crisis is exposing other deep vulnerabilities, too. The source points to huge gaps in cyber and nuclear security, a decaying infrastructure that can't be maintained, and panicked, inconsistent decisions coming from the very top, all signs of a regime that's rapidly losing control. Now, to really understand the gravity of this moment, our source draws a direct comparison to the pivotal 1979 revolution, where, you guessed it, oil strikes also played a decisive role in overthrowing the Shah. But, and this is the key takeaway, our source argues that the differences are absolutely critical. Back in 1979, there was a sense of hope, a vision for an alternative. Today, the motivation is described as just pure anger. The Shah had massive financial reserves. The current regime's treasury is allegedly depleted. The Shah lost international support. This regime's key allies are now becoming liabilities. And all of that brings us to the source's really powerful conclusion. The real battlefield has shifted. The future of Iran, it suggests, is no longer being decided by soldiers with guns, but by engineers with wrenches. Which leaves us all with this final, provocative question. When a regime loses control of its own economic engine and the loyalty of the people who run it, the question isn't if it will fall, but when.